Hello.
Hi, Bill.
Can you hear me okay?
I certainly can.
Okay, pardon the cat. He's in my lap here.
Well, I have two cats in this room. One's asleep on a chair and the other one's asleep on a daybed.
Okay.
So uh, they may decide that they are going to intrude. But,
Oh, okay.
but that's okay. I mean, what one of the sort of amazingly wonderful things about uh, COVID and the Zoom response is that everybody who thought that their neighbor was special uh, noticed that their neighbor had cats walking through their Zoom meetings.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. That is
and
true.
so that's okay. Uh, and people saw what's going on in people's, I see the picture above your head
Yeah.
behind you, and I don't let anybody see my house
Okay.
unless they come to where I've got uh, um, where I've got sort of public spaces available. So,
I see.
uh,
Oh, okay.
but I figure that looking at, a snowy landscape is much more interesting than looking at a messy basement.
Well, looks good to me. Looks good to me. Yeah, real snow. We got a little bit of snow, but I'd like to see a little bit more of it. So like that kind of cover. Okay.
Yeah, this was
Right there.
I was at a,
Yeah, I hit it.
hello, Dagmar. Hello, Kidwells.
Hi. Turn the
I,
volume
I
right
was
here.
at a retreat meeting, something or other at our conference center,
Yeah.
Cathedral Ridge.
Uh-huh.
And the snow started coming down after we arrived, and
Mm-hmm.
this is what found out found later the next day. So
Whoa.
figured that given, I mean, this was a year or so ago, but given what we got yesterday, that bizarre late, well, around 3 o'clock, bad football timing snow
Yes.
that we got, um, that's what's going
That's
on.
for sure.
So,
That's Colorado for sure for you.
I know. As as challenging and as unfortunate as it turned out to be. So,
Yeah. Yes. That's for sure. I'll be right back.
yep. Hello, Dagmar.
Hi. I thought my camera was on. Can you guys see me?
I
Yes,
can
we
see you.
can. Yep.
Well, then good. I
Yep.
don't have to see myself. That's perfect. Okay.
Yeah, I can see you, and I can turn up my volume, and I can
Yeah,
hear
I gotta
you.
do
Um,
Perfect. Thank you.
if I can't, I'll wave. Uh,
that.
the input side of Zoom is always a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
because there are only so many things that you can do uh,
Mm-hmm.
if you're talking in your computer. So,
Yeah. Well, that's for sure.
but I think, let's see. Oh, there may be one more person joining us, so
Wait.
we'll wait a few more minutes
Oh,
and then we'll get going.
there.
Kidwells, you're
There.
there.
Nice to see you.
You're sort of bouncing back and forth like the feed from your camera is.
Oh,
Really?
Uh,
Are we too far away, maybe? We sat back on our couch.
no, she's saying the
no,
feed.
it's just that everything seems to be a
Huh.
series of still shots moving
Oh,
through.
well,
Oh, so the connection isn't good.
do you
I don't
want to?
know.
Should we
Can
pull
hear you
in?
just fine.
Well, you want it might be irritating.
Well,
That's all right.
when we get into
Would you like us to just
the
black ourselves
content,
out?
I'll be
Uh-huh.
showing slides,
Okay.
and it won't be the same thing as this gallery thing. And
Okay.
you've probably experienced that, when things on Zoom get a bit bizarre with video or audio or something like that, turning off the video makes it better. I was in the office
Okay.
earlier today, and I had no internet. It looked like it may have been working if it was plugged in, but via Wi-Fi, I had nothing. So I came home and got home, and it was sketchy Wi-Fi. So I finally just rebooted the whole darn thing.
Well, if we're too hard for you guys to watch, I can just off so you don't have to see us bouncing.
Yeah,
That
yeah. Well, we'll wait for a while. We'll wait
Okay.
for a while.
All right.
Hi, Heather.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Did you get my email back?
I did. I just was looking at it. Thank you.
Okay, so Heather's going to join us when she can, because she has city council responsibilities for which city, Thornton?
Commerce City.
Commerce City.
Mhm.
So that's fine. And for all of you, we are being recorded. And so I will make the recording available after each meeting.
Okay.
So if you have to miss, you can go back and see what you missed.
Okay.
I've got a reserve of all of these recordings because I've been recording them now for 3 or 4 years. I haven't gone back to see which ones are the best.
Yeah.
But it would just be a different group of faces that you were seeing on the Zoom meeting. So one more person may be joining us, but I want to be respectful of your time. And so I'm glad you all are here. And so I'm going to share my screen and trust that I get I have 2 different screens, so I'm going to trust that I get the right ones shared to you. Oops, let's not do that yet. Let's do this. And no, that didn't work, so we'll do it this way. Okay. So are you seeing one screen or 2?
We're seeing one-on-one and just tiny little frames of all of us at the top.
Okay, good. So this is the big deal. Every time I turn this on, I'm never sure whether I get the presenter mode or the mode that you see. So that's just the way that it goes. So we're starting, and I just want to sort of let you know now what we'll be doing for the next several weeks. Tonight is really an introductory evening in many ways. I want to know who y'all are. Everybody else wants to know who y'all are. And then we'll talk about what the arc of the next several weeks will look like. When I say language and other issues, that's, how do we talk about the Episcopal Church? That doesn't have to do with Swedish versus Swahili versus English. But it'll make sense when we get there. And then after we do the introductory stuff tonight and next week, we'll be talking about basically the history of the Episcopal Church. And that means that part of that is kind of the history of the church as a whole, because the Episcopal Church sort of grew out of the church as a whole. But then certainly the Anglican Communion or the Anglican Church and then the Episcopal Church, and there I've got into issues of language already, are a post-16th century phenomenon. And so tonight I trust we'll be able to get through the first 15 centuries. We only have 1,500 years to talk about tonight. But I will tell you when we get there, and I'll reiterate this, that what I really want to focus on is not the whole history of the church, but the history of the church as we experience it as Anglicans or Episcopalians. What happened in some parts of church history doesn't really affect us much. And other things that might be minor in church history affect us a lot. And so that's what I really want to talk about when we talk about the history of the church. So that's the overview of what we'll be doing this evening. But I want to begin by asking who's here. So what I want to know is who's in this virtual room. What is your church background? Not everybody is Episcopalian. We've got some who want some refresher. We've got some who are coming in from other traditions. What's that? What's your knowledge level? I remember teaching a class in church history when I was at Duke, and one of the students in introductory church history had a PhD in history. I hadn't earned my PhD yet, but he had done church history. And so I had a leg up on him there. You all may have experience, training, whatever, in various subfields that will come up over the course of the next several weeks. So what kind of knowledge level do you have in terms of history, theology, any of those kinds of things, because that will help us all. And then are there specific things that you're interested in knowing or learning or being reminded about? It may be how is the Episcopal Church different than the Methodist Church? It may be, I've never quite understood what sacraments are. It may be, so if you've got a specific interest, let me know that. And that way we can make sure, or I can make sure that when we get to any of those areas, I can address them at the appropriate time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to go by the order of the screen that's on my screen, and your order is probably different. And then I'm going to invite somebody in, and then when you're done, you invite somebody else in who's on the screen. So it'll be a mutual invitation thing, but we'll get everybody taken care of. All right. But we're not going to go in any particular order just because your order may differ from mine, and I don't like to be that directive. So I'm going to start with the Kidwells because on my screen, you're right below me. So again, name, church background, knowledge level, specific interests.
Okay. I'm Katie, and my church background is I grew up Catholic, went to Catholic school. We were married in the Catholic Church. We moved here with our young children, and I made sure to get them through the Catholic Church and their sacraments. Almost. Our daughter rebelled at the very last minute, but we dragged our son.
Oh boy, we can talk about that, can't we?
And then, but I left the Catholic Church in about 2004 and joined St. Andrew's United Methodist Church, which I like very, very much. But Brad and I are tired of going to separate churches. And so we thought maybe the Episcopal Church would be one we could agree on and go to together. So that's sort of what brings us here. I think I have a pretty good knowledge level. Like the Catholic or like the Episcopal Church, you get a lot of different readings every week when you grow up Catholic. So I feel fairly well versed in the Bible, and I was a history major in college. So I know a little bit about, well, I was telling Brad, I think, did we come from the Church of England? Well, you'll cover all that. I was bringing up Anne Boleyn at dinner time, but that. Yeah. Anyway, what I'd like to know the most is what the main differences are between Catholicism and the Episcopal Church. How open is the Episcopal Church to people who maybe don't want to say, I'm going to absolutely believe in every single thing you say?
Okay. That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. Brad, you're on the same screen, so.
Oh, no, that's a good thing. My church background is I was born and raised a Catholic. My mom was a Catholic. My dad was not, but they always made sure I went to the church, got the sacraments. I'm still a Catholic, technically, but as you've noticed over the last several months, I've been headed down to St. Shepherd's, Good Shepherds, and yeah, well, that's Catholic in me. But I guess my main thing is, I'm curious and want to learn more about the Episcopal religion, not just how it differs from Catholicism, but other religions as well. I am not well versed, on On the Bible, I'm fairly well versed. Again, being born and educated in the Catholic Church, read the readings, but the historical, I'm not a history major, I was an econ major. So in the historical part, I'm really interested in all this as well, because I have very limited in that background. But yeah, when I came to check out Good Shepherd, it felt good when I walked in. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So you guys get to do rock, paper, scissors and figure out who you're going to invite next.
Yeah.
All right, Bill, we're inviting you because you're next on our screen.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I appreciate that. I don't have any theological background. My earliest memory of the Episcopal Church was as a kindergartner who actually we lived in Denver in 1957, and we would go to the cathedral. And so it was really great doing the parade because I was able to return back there. But anyway, I think my thing, after we left Denver, we moved to Alexandria, and that's where I went to confirmation class. One of the things that I used to always be bewildered about is, the way that the 1920 at the time, the 1928 prayer book, and that's what we had to base our confirmation class on, was confusing to me as to, I always wondered why they picked the certain things that they did. And as time went on, I grew with an appreciation for the church, but the liturgy and the selection of the liturgy and the creeds and all of that, how they all got put in there. So that's the one thing I'm interested in is I'm a systems engineer. So I'm a retired systems engineer. So, so I'm looking at the components of the Episcopal liturgy and how it is put together and the decisions made and how they got, back then I remember it was the Apostles' Creed. Now I was at the last service last Sunday. We were going through the Nicene Creed. I was saying, well, why did they pick this one rather than the Apostles' Creed? And I know that's, another story for another time, but I was curious about that. So that's the kind of questions that I have. And I want to be able to expand that knowledge so I can understand it better. And the other thing is that, I've always been intrigued about the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church. And one last thing I want to say is that I've always been bewildered by the articles of, I guess they call them the articles of faith. I don't know what they call it. It's in the prayer book, but it's the latter part, and that's what you use when you're in confirmation class. But there's a whole set there.
All right.
And I'm really interested in the difference between, I know, I've been fascinated with the catechism in the Catholic Church. And I think, there's over 2,600 paragraphs in the catechism, and there's a lot less paragraphs in the Episcopal articles of faith. So I've just was wondering how all of that stuff comes together. So there's a lot of questions I have, and I'm just going to follow along.
Oh, Bill, you're a teacher's gold mine. That's all great. And we will touch on all of that as we go on through. And I'll say this now, and I'll say it again. Whenever any of you have questions, just stop me, and we'll go through them. We'll address that. I can fill up an hour and a half talking. It's not happy for me because you may not be interested in everything that I'm saying, but I want. This is for you. This is how you get to understand what's going on here. So ask any questions that you have. And I think that those were really, really good. So who are you inviting, Bill?
Is it Heather?
Yeah.
Okay, it's nice to know. I'm a fairly newbie at the church. I'm getting great. I'm trying to remember everybody's name, but I guess I remembered your name. So yeah, you're next.
Well,
Okay, thank you, Bill.
You may be a newbie, Bill, but both you and Heather are newbies on the vestry. So
right.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to be serving together. That's why you recognize my name.
That's right.
Yeah. So Heather Vidlock, I'm a mom of 3 kids. I found the Episcopal Church when I was in high school. I used to go with my boyfriend's family, and then my mom got remarried when I was in college, and my stepdad is Episcopalian. So kind of both sides converged together, and I decided that that was the religion that I wanted to follow. And I went to CU Boulder for undergrad. So I would go to St. John's and actually got baptized there when I was in college. And then when I was working, I'm a city planner. So I was working for the city of Greenwood Village and living in South Denver and going to St. Gabriel's. And that's where I did my confirmation classes back in like 1998. I was looking at my Book of Common Prayer, and it's like, oh, Bishop Jerry Winterroad signed in 1999. So I must have gone through the confirmation classes in 1998. So, I made a conscious choice as a young adult to follow this religion, and it's been our family religion. We go to St. John sometimes on Christmas or Easter because my dad likes the music and the organ. But Good Shepherd has been a great fit for me and the kids. We've been coming here since, I guess I looked back, it's about 2018. We started going to Good Shepherd. And it's just been really good for us. My daughter is involved in the choir, and she's an acolyte, and she's looking at going through confirmation class. So I decided this was good for me since I'm on the vestry now, to brush up, since it's been a while since I went through confirmation classes. And yeah, as a city planner, I've always been fascinated by the evolution of religion and the history. And I love all the ceremony and the symbolism that the Episcopal Church has, so I'm just curious to hear more about the rest of you that are in this class with us, and to go through the course.
Cool. Great. Thank you. Dagmar, you're the
Oh yeah,
last one
Dagmar.
on
Pass it to Dagmar.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, my parents are both British, and so my mother was brought up in the Anglican church. My father really had no religion at all, but when they first moved from England, they went to Toronto, which was a natural transition for British people at that time. So we were in Toronto, which is where I was baptized in the Anglican faith, and then my parents moved down to Colorado, and I would call as what I would call C and E Episcopalians. In other words, Christmas and Easter we would show up, but I didn't really have the background in it. So when I married my husband, he's Catholic, and then I brought my kids up in the Catholic religion, and they've all been confirmed and gone through the sacraments, and even went to Catholic colleges. But I always felt like something was missing. And then recently, 2024, I ended up working for the Mountain Sky Conference of United Methodist Churches. So I was brought into a situation where it's a faith-based organization. We actually pray when we're meeting together. And I started to realize that this is what I was missing in my life, was this. But I felt I needed a little bit more of, I guess I call it the pomp and circumstances of a religion. I did not want to be Catholic, so I thought, let's go back to the Episcopalian, because I think that's the closest to my roots would be. So I'm just here to go along on Bill's coattails and learn everything he can learn. Okay. So,
Welcome.
Okay.
thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. This is wonderful. This is the 8th one of these that I've done, and they all end up, in many respects, having some similarities. A lot of former Catholics or current Catholics exploring. A number of times, there's a mixed marriage, Catholic and something else. And the Episcopal Church looks like a good meeting place religiously. Um, so, I'm hearing that. And I'm also hearing what I've heard before is people who have been Episcopalians for a long time and went through confirmation at some time in the past and then say, I need a refresher course. Um, and that's often true for people like you, Bill, who grew up when the prayer book was changing from the 28 book to the 79 book, and remember the old book and some of that stuff. Um, so it's all good because it all offers an opportunity for us to re-engage or engage anew with traditions and practices that we've done all our lives. When we sit back and think about it, we go, why in the world am I doing that? You know, everybody else gets out from the pew and goes up to communion and kneels, and I do that too because that's what everybody else does, but I don't know why.
That's right.
So those are the kinds of things that we'll talk about. Bill, your question about the catechism, we'll get there. Differences and similarities between the Episcopal Church and other churches, we'll get there. Some of that's historical, some of it's just different ways that theology led churches. We'll get there. So usually we have a lot of fun. I hope we have fun. A little bit about me. Some of you know some of this about me. Newer folks don't. I did not grow up an Episcopalian. I'm not a cradle Episcopalian. I grew up in the Church of the Brethren, which is a German Baptist denomination that developed after the Reformation and is similar to the Amish or the Mennonites. And so it's a peace church. That was the church I grew up in, was a pacifist church. And when I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and there was one Brethren church in all of Portland, which when I was growing up had 300,000 people, and there was one congregation. And I was related to many of them. And so when I got into high school, I wanted to go to a church with my friends rather than with these other people who I couldn't get to without my parents driving me. It was 30 minutes away. So I started attending another church, ended up going to their church college in Eugene, Oregon. And that was where I was introduced to the Episcopal Church when I was in college. And my voice teacher, my singing voice teacher, said, if you want to do church music, Gary, you've got to check out the Episcopal Church because they do it better than anybody else. He was not an Episcopalian, but he was right.
That's good.
And I'm still in touch with him. I had lunch with him a couple of years ago in Eugene, and he's a good guy. So it was at that point the church music and liturgy, all of the bells and smells and all that kind of stuff was sort of the entry drug for me. I was very interested in history, still am, and the church that I was a part of at the time didn't value history quite as much as I liked it. And so I went to seminary thinking I was going to stay in this other denomination, and then realized that no, I was going to go whole hog into the Episcopal Church, and was confirmed while I was in seminary. So I switched denominations, after I'd already finished college, and knew that I wanted to be ordained, or felt that I wanted to be ordained, but that wasn't going to happen for a while. Finished seminary, went to work in secular employment. I was an accountant in paper industry. Lived in Oakland and Emeryville, California. Moved to Southern California, still doing paper accounting, and decided that wasn't where I really wanted to go do, and then decided I wanted to do a PhD. So I trotted off to Duke University, to earn a doctorate in early Christian history. And it was while I was in North Carolina that I went through the ordination process. And so I graduated from seminary in 1981 and wasn't ordained until 1992, which is about as big a gap as I've ever heard of between finishing seminary and getting ordained. All of my classmates in seminary have been long retired. Which is kind of funny. Anyway, when I was in seminary working on my doctorate, the Episcopal campus minister at Duke retired, and he said, "Here, Gary, you take over. They'll find somebody to hire." So I shepherded, pardon the pun, the Episcopal student ministry at Duke for a year and a half. Then they hired somebody to do it, not me. And I trotted off to Charlotte, where my wife was working, and I finished my doctorate. And while I was in Charlotte, I became basically a full-time campus minister. I did that in Charlotte until 1996. Then I became the campus minister at UC Berkeley, and I did that for 11 years. And then in 2007, I came to Denver to be the university chaplain at the University of Denver. So I was responsible for the entire religious life at the university. In 2018, the university decided that they were going to restructure positions, and mine was one of them. And so it was in 2018 that I left the University of Denver and became rector at Good Shepherd. So that's when we first moved to, just a side note, when we first moved to Denver, we lived in Highlands Ranch. I had a day job. I could go anywhere I wanted on Sundays. And I attended Good Shepherd from 2007 until maybe 2012 with my kids. And then for a variety of reasons, having little to do with Good Shepherd, but mostly my kids, we went to the cathedral downtown until 2018. So I've been in Denver for 19 years and at Good Shepherd for the last 8. So that's a little bit about my history. I'm a history geek. I love history. I love liturgics. I love music. So all of those things are things that the Episcopal Church does really, really well, which I think is one of the reasons that I was attracted to it and stayed in it and have been a member of the clergy for 30 many years and all of that. So that's a little bit about me. So I want to ask if anybody has any questions about anybody else's experience or anything like that, or about me. And if not, we'll move on.
I got a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm curious, was the seminary in North Carolina that you went to?
I went to Church Divinity School of the Pacific, which is the Episcopal Church's seminary in Berkeley.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Oh, don't sound so. Oh, I see.
Well, no, I wondered because you were mentioned in North Carolina. I grew up my earlier years in Alexandria, Virginia, and there was an Episcopal seminary there as well. And I was thinking that you might have had some association with that.
No, in fact, that's one of the seminaries that I've never even been on their grounds. And even though I lived in North Carolina, and Duke University had a seminary, Duke Seminary, and there were Episcopalians who attended that seminary, but I had already finished by the time I trotted off to North Carolina.
So, I see. Very interesting.
All right. So how many other cats might we have joining us? Does anybody else have cats? I've got 2 in the room. I was telling Bill before you all got on, I've got 2 in the room with me. Maybe they'll behave tonight. Any other questions? Nope. Okay. So here's what we will be doing over the next 6 weeks. Tonight is introduction of the class and getting into Episcopal or Anglican history. We'll talk about that in a second. Next week, we'll talk specifically, and I've got a video that'll do the talking so you don't have to listen to me most of the evening. about the history of the Episcopal Church. Not the Church of England, not the whole church, but the church's expression in America. The following week, we'll talk about how we worship, what Anglican Episcopal spirituality looks like. The next week, we'll talk about how do Episcopalians read the Bible. And you know, you can say we read the Bible, but how do we interpret it? What tools do we use? If it says one thing that sounds a little bizarre, are there ways that we can understand that? So how do we read the Bible? The next week we'll talk about we read the Bible, but that's not the only thing that we use when we think theologically. So how do we make sense of Scripture and all of that in the world in which we live? And that's a historical question, but it's also a burning question right now in many ways. If you just look at the newspaper for a couple of days, you'll see some people saying, well, this is the Christian viewpoint. And then you'll see other people, no, that's not, this is the Christian viewpoint. How do we make sense of all of this theologically? And Anglicans, Episcopalians, I believe, have a unique set of tools to help us do that. And it comes out of our history, which we'll get to before that, but it also comes out of a number of other things. So we'll talk about that later on. And then the last time we're together is how is the Episcopal Church governed? And by that, I don't mean about how do we just take a vote, but how do we understand the orders of ministry? Where's a deacon? Where's a priest? Where's a bishop? Where do the laity fit in? What's a diocese? How do we fit together all of those things in the Episcopal Church? And it's different than the way the Catholic Church understands governance. It's different than the way the Methodists understand governance. There are overlaps, but they are different. And given what I heard you all say earlier, you want to know where those similarities and differences are. And so they're in every one of these categories. They are in worship. They are in how do we read the Bible. They are in how do we make theological decisions. And they are in how we govern ourselves and how we might grow as a church. So that's what we're gonna do over the next 6 weeks. And again, all of these will be recorded if I remember to hit the record button. And I did this evening. I think, Bill, you heard this meeting is being recorded before everybody else got on. And again, I've taught this a number of times, and there are other recordings of other sessions. So we won't miss anything. You won't miss anything. So if you have to be away, you can. So any questions on any of that before we move on? Nope. Oakley dokley. So now I want, I'm going to show you a brief little video that hits at one of the questions that almost always shows up, and I've already alluded to it, and that's Episcopal versus Anglican.
Yeah.
I get the following. What's the difference between an Anglican and an Episcopalian?
And sometimes I roll pie back by asking the following question. What is the difference between a car and an automobile? The answer, of course, is there isn't, as those two words are synonyms and mean the same thing. So, what is the difference between an Anglican and an Episcopalian? Not too much, except an explanation of why they're calling themselves different words. Well, it all starts in the 17th century in Scotland. Yes, Scotland. The Anglicanism found in England had been introduced there when the kings of Scotland had also become the kings of England. However, in the 17th century, Anglicanism wasn't called Anglicanism yet, at least not in English. Eventually, these Scottish Anglicans needed a way to contrast themselves from their fellow Scottish Protestants, whose church was governed by elders and as such were called Presbyterians. As the Scottish Anglicans used bishops for church governance, they used the term Episcopalians. Fast forward to the end of the 18th century and the American War of Independence, and a similar situation arises. Those Americans who still had the core tenets and beliefs of the Church of England and wanted to contrast themselves with the other Protestants in their country had to find a name for themselves that didn't imply a connection to the nation they had just fought and won independence from. In short, they took a page from the Scots and named their church the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Finally, at the beginning of the 19th century, someone thought it was a good idea to come up with an English word to describe the people that had a common doctrine that originated from the Church of England, or Ecclesiae Anglicana, as it was called in Latin. The word Anglican was derived from the Latin word Anglicania, and luckily it stuck. Thus, the vast majority of the world's Anglicans call themselves Anglicans, while a minority call themselves Episcopalians.
Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we will talk about this more a little bit further down the line, but there's kind of a theological problem now that's arisen in the last 20-25 years, that when the Episcopal Church, again in the last 20-25 years, began to fracture, and sometimes the fracture was over things like ordaining women, sometimes it was about revising the prayer book, sometimes it was about the role of gays, lesbians in the church. The Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion in general, but the Episcopal Church began to fracture. And when groups split off, they were still using the prayer book, they were still having the same kind of ideas about theology and all of that, but they didn't want to call themselves Episcopalian because that aligned them with the National Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church as we call it now. And so they would often use the word Anglican to show that they were still in the trajectory that began in the 16th century, but they weren't Episcopalians. So right down the street from my house, I live over by Cherry Creek Reservoir. Heather, you'll know this because you dealt with Greenwood Village. Right down the street from my house on Bellevue, just west of Dayton. So if you're going to go to the high school, you go down Dayton or you go down Bellevue, unless you're coming in from Aurora. There's now what is called Resurrection Anglican Fellowship. And that's a church that split from the Episcopal Church. In fact, their rector used to be associated with Good Shepherd, has had a long, long time ago. And they are now part of a different denomination than the Episcopal Church. But they call themselves Anglican, which gets really confusing. And there are other churches around Denver that call themselves different things. And we'll get into this again a little bit later when we talk about governance and things like that. So the difference between Episcopal and Anglican can mean, as the narrator here said, it's the difference between car and automobile. But in the United States, in the last 25 years, there have been some other nuances applied to that. So usually if you see Anglican, you can pretty much guess that they've split from the Episcopal Church in the last 20 or 25 years over issues of polity, theology, things like that. But they don't want to disregard their history of being a part of what happened in England in the 16th century. So I know it's confusing and it's frustrating, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go forward. Any questions at this point before we really sort of start into history?
I've got one more quick question, then I'll shut up. Well, what I'm thinking about as you were saying that is, before it, when I first came here, I was going with my parents over to St. Timothy's. And one of the things they used to talk about a lot is I think the ministers there were from a place called Nashotah House or something like that. But they would talk about high church and low church. Is that the same thing as what you're talking about?
No,
Okay.
no. So I'll just briefly touch on that difference between high church and low church. Um, we'll get to it a little bit more next week when
Okay.
we talk about the history of the church.
Okay.
But high church, for all intents and purposes, means that the worship and maybe some of the theology looks more Catholic.
Oh, okay.
So high church might imply candles and crucifixes and incense and bells, and lots of bowing and lots of vestments. That's how it was originally
I
sort
see.
of. Low church would look much more, let's say, Methodist. I'm not being pejorative at all in any of these ways, but you know, somebody who might be standing up in front of you, not in any kind of vestments, but in a suit jacket and a tie, and may have a stole or something
Okay.
like that. They're not using incense. They're not ringing any bells. It's and their theology may be a little different, maybe more. I hate to use the word, but I will anyway. Evangelical. But we'll talk about this a little bit more.
Okay. All right.
But Good Shepherd, just to that point, those distinctions have begun, unless you're on the East Coast or in some big cities, like Chicago or maybe even in San Francisco, those distinctions kind of have gone away. And certainly they're not the case at Good Shepherd. Good Shepherd would be, maybe to some churches in the deep South, would be considered to be Anglo-Catholic because we bow and we ring bells and we've got vestments. But if you go to some churches in Boston or in Chicago, they might see us as being low church because we aren't using incense every week and we aren't genuflecting it every second, So it's a real fungible kind of distinction and is becoming less valuable in reality as time goes on. And that's kind of a historical development. And we'll touch on that a lot next week, maybe a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay. So we'll move. So we're going to talk about Anglicanism, and it's not all about Anne Boleyn. And actually, we probably won't even get to Henry VIII tonight, but that's okay. But going back to what I said earlier, when I talk about the history, I am a church historian. I have a PhD in church history. I am a history wonk, and so I have to rein myself in when I start talking about a lot of this stuff. But what helps me tonight is that I really want to focus on parts of the development of church history that really have to do with the Episcopal Church. So again, I'm not going to talk about things that are unique to the Greek Orthodox or how the Ethiopian Christians worship or anything like that. I find that fascinating, but that's not Episcopal 101. That's a different class. And so what I really want to talk about are things that have to do with the Episcopal Church. And certainly when we start going through these first 15 centuries that we'll try and get through in the next 45 minutes, where the Episcopal Church and Western Christianity overlap, which is basically everything, I will highlight things that end up being a part of our experience as modern Episcopalians. Does that make sense?
Sounds
Yep.
good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Good. So we all remember, well, I won't say we remember, we know that Christianity began at the early part of our era. So at 0, but there was no 0. But Christianity began with the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And most scholars will say that that happened in the early 30s of what we call our era, or what scholars would refer to as the Common Era. We don't talk so much anymore about BC, before Christ, and Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. We talk about before the Common Era and after the Common Era, because even non-Christians, Jews, other people will talk about, well, this is 2026. Well, that date has to do with Jesus, but that's not their world, but we share a common date. And so 2026 is in the Common Era. If you've heard me preach over the last few weeks, you've heard me talk about Babylon and the Babylonian captivity in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. So those are those two things. But, we're talking tonight about the Common Era. Jesus was crucified, died, and resurrected in the early 30s. We already know that the Romans were in Palestine. They were an occupying power. Jesus healed a Roman centurion's servant. They were in contact with one another before Jesus died. Well, with particular attention to our story, the Romans were in Britain. The Romans had conquered Britain in 44, so 10 or 12 years after Jesus died. Well, that meant that there was an influx and an exchange of Roman soldiers, some of whom had become Christians. And so Christianity moved into Britain primarily through soldiers. And then there were some missionaries. So between 44 and then 209, there was movement of Christians and the beginning of conversions in Britain. And that is the sort of the beginning, if you will, of Anglican Christianity. And really, at this point, there was no such thing. It was just Christians who were there as part of the occupying force. What we know is in 209, this gentleman whose picture is there, Alban, was martyred. He was a Christian, and he was martyred because he offered shelter to a Christian missionary from Gaul, so from France, Germany, that area. He harbored that person and gave them shelter, and for that he was martyred. So again, a picture of missionary activity into Britain, resulting in St. Alban's martyrdom. Now, Alban, and I bring this up because Alban shows up. I think that there's a St. Alban's church in this diocese. The parish church that is associated with Washington National Cathedral, the big place where they do all of those amazing funerals. The parish church that is the worshiping congregation that is regular there is St. Alban's. So this saint and his legacy we find all over the world, all over the United States. There, you'll find a church named St. Albans. So I bring that up just so you know where that name comes from. Well, of course, Alban was giving shelter to a missionary at a time when Christianity was illegal. It was still illegal to be a Christian in the empire. And it was more illegal at some times than others, depending on who the emperor was. Some were a little more tolerant. Others were, unless you offer a pinch of incense to me as God, you forfeit your life. So Alban was martyred during that period. Well, then Emperor Constantine assumed the throne of the Roman Empire. And he, I don't want to go into all of this, we could, but in the interest of time, ended up he became a Christian, or at least expressed interest in being a Christian. His mother was, we know that. Um, uh, and he legalized Christianity, which made the movement of Christian missionaries throughout all of the empire a whole lot easier.
May I ask a quick question here?
Of course, please.
I'm just thinking about this. Why was Christianity illegal when the Romans allowed the Jews to continue their religion?
So I'm going to use a sort of contemporary. The Jews were grandfathered in.
Oh,
Yeah.
And so they had been there a long before Rome became the occupying power.
okay.
Okay.
Okay, so they predated Greece, they predated Babylon, so they were an established religion. And so they
Right.
were allowed to continue to practice their religion. The problem with Christianity, and one of the things that they had to figure out how to do, is Christianity growing out of Judaism had to show Rome that they were still kind of Jewish, so should be grandfathered in as well, but they were a little different because they weren't Jewish. Jesus, the Jews didn't think that Christians were part of them.
Right.
So it was a real challenge in early Christianity how to say we are, but we aren't.
Okay.
But that was how they got in. They were basically grandfathered in, and they were
Okay.
Jews were allowed to practice their religion because they were there before the Romans were.
Okay.
Basically,
Thank
and basically, if they didn't upset the apple cart, it was fine.
Okay.
But Christians came along and said, no, Caesar isn't Lord, Jesus is Lord. And then all of a sudden, who are Christians? Where are Christians' allegiances? And so that created tension that kept them illegal. Well, when Constantine converted and beat his opponent and became the emperor of the Roman Empire, he, said, well, we're going to make these folks legal, and probably for some political reasons. And that was what happened at that point. Okay, make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so I have on this slide 314, the Council of Arles. Not a particularly important council. When I say council, it's a gathering of bishops. Not particularly important, but at the Council of Arles, Britain sent 3 bishops, a priest, and a deacon to participate in this council. So within 270 years of the Romans conquering and taking over Britain, Christianity being legalized and all of that, with all of that, there was enough Christian infrastructure in Britain that they could send 2 bishops, a priest and a deacon to participate in this council. So Christianity was being established in Britain. When we get to the Council of Nicaea in 325, there were a lot of British there. So the church again had continued to grow. And the creed that was accepted at Nicaea, the one that we kind of say, well, we say the Nicene Creed, but it's gotten changed a little bit after Nicaea itself. That creed was accepted. The decisions of the council, those were accepted in Britain. So we now see that Britain is becoming part of this larger global Christianity. Then in 370 and moving on, the Anglo-Saxons, which were not in Britain, coming in from Europe, occupied, all these pagans occupied Britain. And so you've got some original Brits, you've got the Christian Brits, and then you've got the Anglo-Saxons that have come in, and you've got this melange of people living in the British Isles. But the missionary activity continues. And so don't pay any attention to the numbers on the right. They help me find my notes. So in 400, Ninian, who was a Roman-trained bishop and friend of Martin of Tours, who was a famous, well-known, he became a saint, but a well-known figure in Gaul, was evangelizing the Picts. So these are the Northern Scots. So the Northern Scots are beginning to be evangelized. There's a priest named Pelagius who, I say, arises, gains influence, and he was one that was really strong, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about theology, really strong in asserting that it's what you do that makes you a Christian, not what you believe. And so that became a problem because it began to crowd out the idea that it's grace that saves you, not your works. And he basically became condemned as a heretic. But English Anglican theology still holds on to what now is called semi-Pelagianism, and is a quality of who we are, that it's not some, and we'll get into this when we talk about theology, it's not all about what you do, but it certainly isn't all about what you believe, that there has to be some connection between what you believe and what you do. And that's sort of semi-Pelagianism, or at least as that got called out. Patrick arrives in Ireland there in the 5th century. He was a Briton. He was from Britain, from a clerical family. So he was at least second, maybe third generation Christian by the time that he went to Ireland. He was an Irish slave, and he went back to Ireland as a bishop. And so he organized, evangelized, helped the poor, confronted the Druids, so he did more than pick a shamrock and get rid of the snakes. He was a significant figure, historical figure, that, has gotten sort of mythologized over the course of time. Close to the middle of the 5th century, Pope Leo the First, also the Great, now known as the Great, assumed the papacy. And one of the things that he did was he changed the method of calculating Easter. Now, Easter, if you read the Bible carefully, the New Testament carefully, Easter falls within a couple of days of Passover. Jesus is the Paschal Lamb, all of those kinds of things. Passover moves, because it's on the Jewish calendar. And so if Passover moves, Easter moves with it. Well, what happens when Easter falls on a bad day? Just because it could fall on Super Bowl Sunday. What are we going to do if Easter falls on Super Bowl Sunday? And so do you date Easter based on the Passover? Or do you go back and you figure out when Easter would have been in 33 AD and say, oh, it's always going to be on this particular day? And there was a difference of opinion in Britain than there was in the rest of Europe. Well, Leo codified Easter for the Roman Church. So just hold that thought, that he codified it for the Roman Church. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. So Patrick, all these other guys are coming in and evangelizing. In 500, there was a monastery founded in Tintagel, wherever that is. I think it's in Ireland. So the monastic life becomes important in Britain. And we see how that works its way through its history, and we'll see that as we continue talking. But here it is at the beginning of the 6th century. In 530, we've got David, Saint David, begins to evangelize Wales. A couple of 30 years later, Columba heads back in to Scotland. These are names that you hear: St. David, St. Columba. David's the patron saint of Wales. You start to hear these things. You wonder, well, where did they come from? And this is where they came from. As I said, this is why I'm focusing on the things that really talk about the British Isles. You travel around the United States, you go into different towns, cities, you'll find a St. Columba's church, you'll find a St. David's church. That's why their connection to the Episcopal Church. Well, in the end of the 6th century, Augustine, and we Episcopalians have a problem with this, was sent, he was a Benedictine monk. Now, there's St. Augustine or Augustine of Hippo, who was a 4th century theologian, and then there's St. Augustine of Canterbury, who was a 6th century missionary. And most Episcopalians will distinguish between the two by how they pronounce their names. So Augustine of Hippo and Augustine of Canterbury. Exactly the same name. Augustine of Hippo, famous doctor of the church, so influential in our theology. But Augustine of Canterbury was sent by the Pope as a Benedictine. He baptizes Ethelbert, who was the King of England. And so now you've got a tie between the ruling house of England and the church. And that, again, these are connected. In 630, we get Aidan, another name that you'll see. There's a church in Boulder that's St. Aidan's. He came and he established, these are all monastic folks. These are all monks. And they are establishing congregations and monasteries throughout Britain. And the place that Aidan established is called Lindisfarne Abbey. Pilgrimages are made to Lindisfarne all the time. It's still there, not in quite the same way, obviously, it was in the 7th century, but you can go to Lindisfarne. And he was a hermit and a preacher, shepherd monk. He became the bishop of Lindisfarne. And so, again, a significant figure in British church history. A few years later, there was this famous synod in 664. And some of these monasteries, they weren't just women and they weren't just men. These were dual monasteries where the women had one building and the men had another building, and they would worship together, and then they would go back to their separate buildings. Well, Whitby was one of these, and there was a very famous synod, a gathering of bishops and clergy at Whitby. You can still go to Whitby Abbey. And my question there, in 664 AD, the day of which annual religious festival was calculated at Whitby Abbey? So what do you think? Famous religious festival. Okay, so the Celtic Church, the church that grew up in Britain, was not the Roman Church. They had different practices, like dual monasteries with women over here and men over here. It wasn't the bishops that ruled what was going on, it was the abbots of the monasteries. That was very different in Britain than it was in Europe. And at the Council of Nicaea and then with Leo, they argued over the day of when you calculate Easter, and they made a decision. The Celtic Church in Britain never went along with that. And so in 664, what happened at this synod was this joining or this melding of the British Church, the Celtic Church's practices, with the Continental Church's practice. So the day of the religious festival that was calculated at Whitby was Easter, when the Celtic Easter and the Roman Easter became the same Easter. So again, significant. Did I hear somebody who wanted to ask a question?
No, I just said, wow.
Yeah, there's just so much in we're glossing over a lot. We've already gone through 600 years, and we've got another 800 to go. So, moving into the medieval period, in the 730s, this gentleman named the Venerable Bede, he was a deacon, but he wrote a what's called a history of the English church and its people. And so because of what he wrote, we know the history of what I just talked about. At the end of the 8th century, we have Alcuin, who was a deacon, an agent of Charlemagne. So again, we start thinking about these things. What's going on in Britain when all of that history that we can remember that's going on on the continent is going on? We don't think about the English church and Charlemagne having anything to do with each other. Charlemagne's over there doing what Charlemagne did. And then, was the English church doing anything? Well, yeah, Alcuin was an agent of Charlemagne. And he introduced some prayers that you hear every Sunday. Almighty God, to whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid. That was Alcuin's prayer that I say every Sunday morning. It's been around 1400 years. So I bring him up because we have a tie to him every Sunday morning when that prayer is said. Of course, 800, Charlemagne sets a precedent, and there he is on your left, as a Christian king. And this tie between the royal house with the church becomes established at the beginning of the 9th century. And that then spills into Britain. We have Alfred the Great becomes the king of the West Saxons and unites the British people. Again, here he is, a Christian king. 973, Dunstan, known as St. Dunstan now, crowns King Edward of all England. So the church is legitimizing the secular rulers in Britain. And we just, and preached on the ideal of a Christian king. So we see this, when Charles became king a few years ago, right? The intertwining of the Church of England and the power of the state were right there. That was one of the things that theoretically was separated in the Revolutionary War, right? The separation of the church and state, theoretically. So we see where this was established, 1400 years ago. Alphege, at the bottom of the page, I just throw in out of personal privilege. He was a missionary who went to Denmark and was trying to convert the Danes, and they didn't like some things that he was doing, so they beat him to death. And it's his feast day that I was ordained a priest. So I just remember, I just good old Saint Alphege. The preacher at my service says that he was boned to death by having been beaten with the bones of some donkeys or something. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. Personal privilege happened in mid-April. So, so moving on, Battle of Hastings. If you're history people, you remember the Battle of Hastings. The Norman conquest, William the Conqueror comes in, becomes king, but he burned down, or a lot of churches were actually burned down accidentally when he became king. So, that's the Battle of Hastings. We think about 1066. There was an effect on the churches in Britain. 1070, Margaret becomes queen. And there's this unification of she was English, she marries Malcolm, who was in Scotland, and this connection of the English crown and the Scottish crown. Again, this one island Britain with these different countries, Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, Britain, England. So this is all going on. In 1080, William sends a letter to the Bishop of Rome that the King of England owes the Bishop of Rome no allegiance. So we start to see with William the Conqueror a potential split between how Britain sees its ties to Rome. And of course, Rome was both a political and a religious power at this time. But how are the two linked, if at all? Well, Britain has seen itself as separate from the continent in terms of Easter and all these other kinds of things. Here's another example of seeing itself a little bit separate from the continent. 1093, Anselm of Canterbury. He was a famous philosopher. I bring him up just because of he proposed what was known as the ontological proof for the existence of God. So this is at that point in church history known as the scholastic period, where you got all these philosophers who are trying to prove God's existence. You know, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? All of these kinds of really weird questions. But Anselm was right in there in that mix. Moving into the 12th century, Thomas à Becket. Did any of you see the movie Becket that came out, I don't know, 40 years ago, or, but Becket was a problem. He was related to Henry II, not related, but he was around when Henry II became Archbishop of Canterbury. But he began to sort of assert his power, or the church not being subject to the king. And, the classic line of Henry II is, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" And Murder in the Cathedral, that T.S. Eliot, I think it was T.S. Eliot, play, and he was martyred in the cathedral by 4 knights. And in Canterbury Cathedral. So his tomb is still a pilgrimage site to talk about how does the church relate to the state, and how far is the church going to go in terms of its relationship to the state. Well, the church reimposed its authority in 1208, 100 or 80 years later. The Bishop of Rome wanted somebody to sort of oversee how Britain related. Britain said no. And so the Pope at the time imposed what was known as interdict. Do any of you know what interdict is? I love interdict. I wish our Pope would use it. I think most of you have heard of excommunication, right?
Yep.
So excommunication is a sentence imposed on somebody that says you no longer have access to the sacraments. You are out of communion with the church. And so I've known a lot of divorced Catholics who can point to a piece of paper that they received saying that they were excommunicated because of their divorce. Interdict is similar, but it's national. So basically, the Pope can tell the clergy in Spain, I'll just use Spain, although in this case it's Britain, you can no longer celebrate the sacraments. Which means that people who die don't get Christian burial. Baptism can't happen. All of these things can't happen because the Pope tells the clergy who are obedient to the Pope that they can't do that, and that becomes the papal way of exercising influence over a country. And it was a problem. Their way, the folks' way of thinking theologically was a little different than ours. Most of our folks would say, oh yeah, whatever, but that's not the way that it worked in that world. And so the Pope imposed interdict on Britain, and Britain finally relented. And the Pope removed it. As part of that, King John ended up signing the Magna Carta. I mean, there are all of these things that have to do with interdict, which is why I love it. I just think, it would be really interesting to see what happened if our American Pope decided to do something with interdict, what that would look like. So anyway, these are games church historians play when we get together and have had too much to drink. So we'll continue to move forward a few more minutes, just things that again have to apply to us today. Francis of Assisi, you remember his name, you remember Saint Dominic, these monastic orders that arose in the 13th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Certainly there was monasticism. It was all Benedictine. From St. Benedict. The monasticism in Britain was all Benedictine. And there is so much of Anglican spirituality that is Benedictine in nature. And all of those monasteries that we were talking about had Benedictine flavor. But now the Franciscans and the Dominicans are starting to show up in Britain. So we've got a different set of missionaries that are coming in. So they're beginning to arrive. Salisbury Cathedral, I bring that up. It was a famous cathedral, of course, in the city of Salisbury. A lot of current Episcopal Church worship is derived from the way that worship was done in Salisbury Cathedral. And it's kind of arcane to talk about. But, where does our worship arise? Well, it came up, and this was a question that one of you asked earlier on. Our worship arose out of practices that had centuries of historical antecedents. I mentioned Alcuin and, Almighty God, to whom all hearts are open, all desires known, centuries. The fact that we at Good Shepherd and other churches, we're not alone, use blue vestments in Advent, that following the practice that was done in Salisbury. Purple vestments in Advent were other parts of the Catholic Church. So the many churches in the Episcopal Church follow that custom of using blue. But there are other things that are more that are less obvious, I will say. But there is a lot that comes from Salisbury. So that was finished in 1220. Roger Bacon, famous philosopher and inventor, priest, invented the telescope and the microscope. So I bring that up only because the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church, has never really had a problem with science. And that will come up, we'll talk about more when we start talking about theology. But it's how do we understand God's world? And these are means. Microscopes and telescopes are means of our learning more as we move forward. William of Ockham, how many of you have heard of Occam's razor? This is a philosophical way of making decisions. Mm-hmm. So, the simplest explanation is usually the best. That's Occam's razor. And so William of Ockham, an English Franciscan friar, and he had to take his ideas and defend them in front of the Pope. So here we're seeing all of this interplay of all of this stuff that's going on the continent as well as what's going on in the British Isles. And there are some ways that the Brits are seeing themselves differently than the continental folks. Almost done. So in 1350, we've got the Black Plague. What a disruption that was for all of Europe. Julian of Norwich was an anchorite. She was a mystic, holed herself up in a little room at the Cathedral of Norwich, and was an advisor, a spiritual director, known as the person who said, "All will be well, all will be well, and all manner of things will be well." She said that in the middle of the plague. So here she is bearing witness to a hope and assurance that God is ultimately in control and the plague will not rule. And that her saying became really popular during the pandemic. Again, as people recalled, this is why she said this. It wasn't just some abstract, disconnected thing. It was in the middle of the plague when her faith said, all will be well, all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. This lone woman, advisor to many. Towards the end of the 14th century in Britain arose this gentleman, John Wycliffe. He was a theologian at the University of Oxford. I always find it sobering to think that the University of Oxford was a university 900 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. So he was there. He denied. He had some theological differences with the dominant theology of the Eucharist. He was he really appealed to the Bible over against sort of traditional theology, and basically was a heretic. And but he's coming up, and we owe a lot to Wycliffe. He ended up, I think, getting martyred. Can't remember exactly when that happened. I throw in Geoffrey Chaucer just because Canterbury Tales. And I mentioned a while back that Becket's tomb in Canterbury became a pilgrimage site. That's where all of these pilgrims in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales were going. They were going to Becket's tomb in Canterbury. Now, whether or not they were all sort of spiritual, I don't know. I'll leave that to your reading of Canterbury Tales. But I throw that in there just because it's one of those things, one of those people, and a book that we know about, but it does have relationship to the church, to the Anglican Church. Marjorie Kempe was a very eccentric visionary, but again, coming out of the Anglican Church, advisor to kings, but she was wacko. I mean, she would go off on sort of ecstatic, all sorts of things, and nobody could sort of trust her. So probably bipolar, we might say now. But when she was herself, she was an advisor to royalty and to leaders around Europe. They would come and seek her counsel. Then we get to 1485 and the War of the Roses. If you know much about the English churches or the English history, we've hit the English Civil War, and or one of the civil wars that England fought. And that had the product of Henry VII being the first Tudor king. So sort of the precursor, if you will, to Henry VIII, which is where we will get next week. And we can talk about Anne Boleyn and all those other kinds of things. But that's a lot. I did have a video that did this a whole lot better, but somebody borrowed it several years ago, and I can't remember who, and it was never returned. So you were stuck with me and my idiosyncratic way of moving through 1,500 years of church history.
You
But
did
again,
that
it was,
well.
That was pretty good.
We're impressed.
oh, well, whatever. But again, I want to stress that the English church grew up side by side with the continental church. And at various points during its 1,500, at least these first 1,500 years, it was kind of in sync. Other times it was a little off. Sometimes they were in conflict. And so Britain, this island, was not part of the continent. And we as Episcopalians, and this gets to some of the questions that you asked early on, as Episcopalians, we have similarities with the Catholic Church, and we have some differences. And some of those differences has to do with the fact that we developed differently over the course of those 1,500 years. And we still cherish some of those differences in the way that they moved. So there, we think there's a lot of talk these days about Celtic spirituality. Well, that infused Anglican Christianity in a way that it didn't infuse sort of continental spirituality. The ways of worship were slightly different. The ways of authority, again, slightly different. And we'll really see that next week when we start talking about Henry VIII. We saw it with, can't remember who told the Pope, you don't run England. You're not the boss of me. And, that kind of stuff. I mean, so we're part of that. And we develop differently. And how all of that works, again, will become really a little bit more apparent next week. So that's where we are now. The video that I showed at the beginning came from this website, youtube.com, Maple Anglican. If you go to that website, there's an incredible wealth of videos there on all sorts of stuff. There used to be another resource that I would point. That's why the slide says resources. And I went to one of the ones that I have used in the past, and I keep getting the warning message that says, this is now an unsafe website. So clearly it lost its charter and has been taken over by somebody else. And I don't follow the site through to keep saying, because the computer keeps telling, you're going to get in trouble if you go this direction. There's going to be something that's going to bite your computer and it will never work again if you go this direction. All of those warnings that we get. But youtube.com, Maple Anglican, has a lot of really, really good videos. And I just showed that one about the difference or similarity between Anglican and Episcopalian. So, any questions before we stop for the evening? On any of this or on the course, what will look like over the next 5 weeks?
No, do you encourage us to just read this book sort of for additional information? You're not like following it.
What a really, really good question. As a teacher, that's what I think I am best. I'm not one of those people who likes to go through and reprise what was on page 37. I would say read the book. I'll refer to it. I'll go in step with it, and I'll go in different directions. Same thing with the articles. We don't have a lot of time to do all of the stuff that we do. So with the reading and what I do, it just becomes a better way of sort of, I won't say better, but a different way of sort of pulling all of this stuff together and letting them talk to each other.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm kind of idiosyncratic. I think I'm a good scholar, but I don't necessarily follow the party line all the time. So the articles, if you haven't gone to the Google Drive to see where the articles are or the syllabus is, make sure that you do that. Partly because I want to know if you have problems accessing any of that, but that's where there will be articles.
Okay.
That will complement what's in the book. Yeah, without doing a much larger course, it would be very difficult to get all this information out. So it's a very good question. Yeah. I told students when I was teaching at Duke and other places, I said, you read the book, we'll talk about this, put those two things together, but I'm not going to tell you what's on page 37.
Good. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
This is enlightening for me because you're putting a different perspective on the Celts. I always thought of the Celts as like Stonehenge and New Age and Druids and those people like that. I never thought they were associated with Christianity. So this is interesting how this is weaving together here.
So thank you for raising that. Certainly, there is a lot of sort of spiritual overlap between the sort of Celtic religions that predated Christianity, and then when Christianity came in. And so, what do you do? And this has been a point of argument over the centuries. What do you do when you come in and there's already an established religion? Do you blow it all away and piss everybody off, or do you point out where there are similarities and adopt them?
I see.
And then sort of baptize them. And so I'll tell a brief story that I'll may point out. I think I'll get to it later on. I went to Costa Rica many years ago, and the national shrine in Costa Rica is at a place called Cartago. And at that shrine, there is a grotto and there is a well. Those were considered sacred by the native people of Costa Rica ever before the Spaniards got there. But now it's the national shrine, and it's the shrine of Our Lady of whatever. And the grotto has all of these religious medals that are all Catholic about healings. The water in the spring is all taken and has all been turned into sort of holy water by the adoption of the church. So do you baptize what is there and saying you just misunderstood, or do you turn it all over and say you were absolutely wrong?
Wow.
And so there's a lot of Celtic practice, especially in terms of, let's say, honoring creation and God's presence in the natural world, that you can say this resonates with a lot of Christian beliefs without turning it into some kind of nature religion.
Oh, okay.
So how do you do this? And the church has faced that problem or challenge or opportunity forever. And whenever it's gone on a missionary venture. So thinking about it just from our standpoint in the Southwest, how do we understand Native American spirituality vis-a-vis traditional Christianity? And you'll find people who will say, yeah, we can talk about the Great Spirit. That works for us. And you know, that just another word for God and all those kinds of things. We understand that. And other people will say, no, that's pagan. We got to rub it out.
Yeah.
So the thing with the Celts is the same kind
Interesting.
of.
Okay. Interesting. Got it.
Cool. Any other questions? Cool. Heather, how can I get the book to you tomorrow or Wednesday?
So could you leave it at the front? I work from home on Wednesdays, so I could swing by the church office and pick it up, or get it in the evening. I'm not, whatever works.
Okay. Where do you live?
I'm around on Wednesday.
Where do you live? Roughly?
Oh, I just live in Willow Creek, across the street.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. We'll connect by email and figure out what the best way to do.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Good. All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Great.
Enjoyed it.
See you next week. I will not be there on Sunday. I've got my wife's mother's funeral to go to this weekend. So.
Oh, that's right. Sorry about that.
So, but I'll see you next Monday night.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank
Peace,
you.
y'all.
Good to see you. Bye.